Most overwatered plants don't collapse overnight. In fact, many of them still look green for quite a while. And that's part of what makes this problem so easy to miss. A garden can appear healthy on the surface, while the roots underneath are slowly struggling. From my experience, a lot of gardeners water more out of concern than neglect. We see dry weather, warm afternoons, or a leaf that looks slightly tired, and we instinctively reach for the hose. It feels like we're helping. But sometimes the constant moisture around the roots creates a very different kind of stress. A slower kind, a quieter kind. And the difficult part is, the warning signs usually don't look dramatic at first. Growth slows down, leaves stay smaller, the soil never quite dries naturally, and over time, the plant begins spending more energy surviving than growing. In this video, we're going to look at some of the early signs people often miss, why overwatering is more common than many gardeners realize, and how a few small changes in observation can make a surprisingly big difference over time. Because in many home gardens, healthier plants don't always come from doing more. Sometimes they come from learning when to step back a little. One of the hardest things about overwatering is that it usually comes from good intentions. Most people don't stand in their garden thinking, I want to damage this plant. It's usually the opposite. We water because we care, because the weather has been hot, because the soil surface looks dry, or simply because watering feels productive, like we're actively helping the garden. And honestly, I've done this myself more times than I'd like to admit. Sometimes a plant looks slightly tired in the afternoon sun, and our first instinct is to reach for water immediately. But temporary stress from heat and actual dryness are not always the same thing. A plant can look tired for a few hours and still have perfectly moist soil underneath. This is where many watering habits slowly become routines instead of observations. A lot of home gardeners water on schedule, every morning, every evening, every day at the same time. At first, it feels responsible, consistent, safe. But soil doesn't dry at the same speed every day. Cloud cover changes things, humidity changes things, wind changes things. And mature plants often use water very differently from younger plants. In many gardens, the problem isn't a single heavy watering. It's the constant repetition of small amounts of water that never allows the soil to breathe properly again. Especially in containers or dense soil, moisture can stay trapped far longer than people realize. And because the damage happens slowly, gardeners often keep watering even more, thinking the plant looks weak from thirst. That's what makes overwatering so deceptive. The symptoms often encourage the exact behavior that caused the problem in the first place. Over time, gardening becomes much easier when we stop asking, when should I water again? And start asking, what is the soil actually telling me today? One of the biggest misunderstandings in home gardening is the idea that wet soil automatically means healthy soil. But moisture and oxygen have to stay in balance underground. Roots do need water, that part is true, but they also need small pockets of air moving through the soil around them. And when water stays trapped too long, those spaces slowly disappear. From the surface, this can be difficult to notice. The soil may still look dark and rich. The leaves may still look green. And because nothing dramatic happens right away, many gardeners assume everything underneath is doing fine. But healthy soil usually feels alive in a very particular way. It holds moisture without feeling heavy. It drains gradually instead of staying soaked. And after watering, it slowly returns to a lighter, more breathable texture. Suffocating soil feels different. It often stays cold and dense for too long. Sometimes the surface even looks slightly shiny or compacted after repeated watering. And when roots sit in those conditions day after day, stress begins building quietly underground. Not because the plant received too much care, but because the roots no longer have the environment they need to function normally. This is why some plants begin struggling even when gardeners are consistently watering and feeding them. The issue is not always the amount of nutrients. Sometimes the roots simply cannot access what they need efficiently anymore. Especially in heavy clay soil, shaded beds, or containers without enough airflow, excess moisture can linger much longer than expected. And over time, soil stops behaving like a balanced growing environment and starts behaving more like a constantly wet sponge. One thing many experienced gardeners eventually learn is that healthy soil rarely feels extreme. Not bone dry, not soaking wet, just slightly moist, open, and alive. When people think about healthy plant growth, water is usually the first thing that comes to mind. And of course, water matters. But over time, many gardeners discover that roots need something just as important: space. Not empty space above the soil, space inside the soil itself. Tiny pockets where air, moisture, microorganisms, and roots can all exist together in balance. Healthy roots are surprisingly active. They are constantly absorbing water, exchanging gases, responding to temperature, and slowly exploring the soil around them. But for all of that to happen, the soil cannot stay completely saturated all the time. When the spaces between soil particles remain filled with water for too long, oxygen movement becomes limited. And without enough oxygen, roots begin functioning less efficiently. What makes this difficult is that the decline is often subtle at first. Plants may still survive, leaves may still look acceptable, but underground, the roots gradually lose the healthy environment they rely on every day. In many cases, roots stop expanding normally, new growth slows down, and the plant becomes more sensitive to heat, stress, and nutrient imbalance. From my experience, this is one reason some gardens seem stuck. Not dying, not thriving either, just sitting in the same condition for weeks or even months. And very often, gardeners respond by adding even more water or fertilizer, hoping to restart growth again. But if the roots are already stressed from lack of airflow, more inputs usually don't solve the real issue. Especially in compact soil, heavy rain periods, or containers with poor drainage, roots may spend long stretches simply trying to cope. One thing healthy soil usually provides is rhythm. It becomes moist after watering, then gradually lighter again, then moist again later. That natural cycle matters more than many people realize, because roots are not designed to live in constant extremes. They function best in soil that can breathe between waterings. One reason overwatering becomes so confusing is that plants don't always look unhealthy right away. In fact, some overwatered plants stay surprisingly green for quite a long time. And because most gardeners naturally look at the leaves first, it's easy to assume the plant is still doing well. But leaf color only tells part of the story. A plant can remain green while the root system underneath is slowly becoming weaker. Healthy roots support much more than color. They support growth, energy movement, new shoots, root expansion, and the plant's ability to recover from stress. When roots begin struggling in constantly wet soil, plants often enter a quieter form of survival. Not dramatic collapse, not immediate yellowing, just slower development. You may notice smaller new leaves, shorter stems, less vigorous growth, or plants that seem to pause for long periods without improving. In many gardens, these signs appear weeks before obvious damage shows up. And this is where people often become unintentionally trapped. The plant seems weak, so more water is added. But if the roots are already stressed from excess moisture, additional watering can quietly extend the same cycle. From my experience, one of the most useful things a gardener can learn is how to separate green appearance from healthy function. Because plants are often much slower to show root problems above ground than people expect. Especially during cooler weather or in large established plants, symptoms may stay subtle for quite a while. Healthy growth usually has movement to it. New shoots slowly expanding, leaves reaching outward naturally, steady development over time. But stressed plants often feel still, not dying quickly, just not truly progressing anymore. And sometimes, that quiet lack of progress is the real warning sign. One of the reasons overwatering can continue for so long is that slow growth rarely feels urgent. Most gardeners react quickly to yellow leaves, wilting, or visible damage. but slower development is much easier to overlook. Especially in busy gardens, plants that simply stay the same often don't attract much attention at first. From my experience, this is where many root-related problems quietly begin revealing themselves, not through dramatic symptoms, but through the absence of healthy movement. New leaves stop increasing in size. Stems remain shorter than expected. Plants lose some of their natural energy and rhythm. And because these changes happen gradually, they often feel normal day to day. This is why comparison over time becomes so important in gardening. Sometimes the clearest warning sign is not what the plant is doing, but what it stopped doing. Healthy plants usually keep moving forward in small ways. Roots expand, new shoots appear, leaf spacing changes. Growth slowly builds on top of previous growth. Even during slower seasons, there is often some sense of progress. But plants dealing with excess moisture often become hesitant. Not dead, not collapsing, just unable to fully develop. And when roots stay stressed long enough, the entire plant begins operating more cautiously. Water movement slows, nutrient uptake weakens, recovery from heat becomes harder. Over time, the garden can begin looking tired without any obvious single cause. I think this is one reason experienced gardeners spend less time chasing dramatic symptoms and more time observing patterns. Because healthy gardens usually feel active and responsive over time, while struggling gardens often feel strangely still. Most long-term watering problems do not come from one dramatic mistake. They usually come from small habits repeated over and over again. And because these habits often look responsible on the surface, many gardeners never question them. One of the most common examples is shallow daily watering. The soil surface becomes wet very often, but deeper root zones may never experience a healthy cycle of moisture and airflow. Over time, roots can become weaker, more dependent on constant surface moisture, and less resilient during heat or dry conditions. Another habit that quietly creates stress is watering by routine instead of observation. Every morning, every evening, no matter what the weather has been. But gardens do not experience the same conditions every day. A cloudy, cool week and a hot, windy afternoon affect soil very differently. Sometimes gardeners also water too quickly. Large amounts of water hit the soil surface faster than the ground can absorb naturally. In dense soil, this can lead to pooling, compaction, and trapped moisture near the roots. And in containers, repeated watering without enough drainage can leave potting mix constantly damp for long periods. From my experience, another hidden issue is emotional watering. People water because they feel worried, because the plant looks tired, or because caring for the garden feels comforting after a stressful day. And honestly, that instinct is very human. But healthy gardening usually becomes easier once observation starts leading the decision instead of emotion or habit. Healthy soil tends to move in cycles. Moisture enters, air returns, roots respond, growth continues. But when the soil never changes, the roots eventually stop responding well too. And many struggling gardens are not suffering from lack of effort. They are simply receiving the same kind of care too often. A very common assumption in gardening is that more water helps plants absorb more nutrients. And at first, that idea sounds reasonable. Water does help move nutrients through the soil. Roots do need moisture to function properly. But healthy nutrient absorption depends on much more than simply keeping the soil wet. Roots absorb nutrients best when the surrounding environment stays balanced. Not too dry, not constantly saturated. When soil remains overly wet for long periods, oxygen levels around the roots begin dropping. And without enough oxygen, root activity gradually slows down. This creates a strange situation that confuses many gardeners. The soil may still contain nutrients. Fertilizer may already be present, but the roots themselves are no longer functioning efficiently enough to use those resources properly. So plants can begin showing signs of weakness, even while sitting in rich soil. Growth slows, leaves become smaller, color may appear duller over time. And because the symptoms resemble nutrient deficiency, many people respond by adding even more fertilizer or water. But stressed roots often do not need more. They need recovery. They need airflow, balanced moisture, time, and a healthier underground environment. Especially in dense, wet soil, nutrients can also move differently than people expect. Some nutrients may become less available. Others may wash downward too quickly with repeated watering. And over time, the soil environment itself can become less stable. One thing healthy gardens usually show is steady response. Not explosive growth, not constant correction, just gradual, consistent development over time. And in many cases, healthier roots come not from adding more and more, but from restoring balance underground first. One of the most difficult things about root stress is that almost all of it happens out of sight. We naturally pay attention to what we can see: leaves, stems, flowers, color. But the part of the plant managing water, nutrients, stability, and recovery is hidden underground. And by the time serious symptoms appear above the soil, stress may already have been building for quite a while. Healthy roots are usually active, flexible, and constantly expanding into new spaces. They respond to moisture changes. They search for oxygen. They adapt slowly to temperature and soil conditions. But when soil remains overly wet for long periods, that underground system begins operating under pressure. Not sudden pressure, quiet pressure. At first, the roots may simply slow down. Then, some areas stop growing normally. The surrounding soil becomes heavier and less breathable. Microbial balance may begin changing. And eventually, the plant starts spending more energy coping with stress than developing new growth. This is why some gardens feel strangely stagnant even when people continue caring for them carefully. The plant is surviving, but survival and healthy development are not always the same thing. In many cases, gardeners respond to this hidden stress by increasing care, more watering, more feeding, more adjustments. But underground stress often improves the same way many natural systems improve: slowly, with airflow, with recovery time, with healthier soil structure. And sometimes, the most helpful thing we can do is stop interrupting the soil long enough for balance to return naturally. Experienced gardeners often learn to notice subtle shifts long before obvious damage appears. The garden becomes quieter. Growth becomes hesitant. The soil stays heavy longer after watering. And those small patterns usually matter more than dramatic symptoms, because underground stress rarely announces itself loudly. It simply changes the rhythm of the garden over time. One of the reasons container plants are so easy to overwater is that pots do not behave like garden soil in the ground. At first glance, the two may seem similar. Both contain soil, both hold roots, both need water. But underneath the surface, moisture moves through containers very differently. In-ground soil usually connects to a much larger natural system. Water can spread outward. Excess moisture can move deeper into surrounding soil. Temperature changes happen more gradually. But inside a container, everything is more limited. The root zone is smaller, airflow is reduced more easily, and moisture often stays trapped longer than people expect, especially in plastic pots, shaded patios, or containers with dense potting mix. The soil may remain damp long after the surface appears dry. This creates one of the most common gardening mistakes: watering based only on the top layer. The upper inch may feel dry from sun or airflow, while deeper areas around the roots are still heavily saturated. And because containers dry unevenly, visual appearance alone can become very misleading. Another challenge is that stressed container roots usually react faster than roots in the ground. Once airflow becomes limited, small root systems can weaken surprisingly quickly during warm weather. This is why container plants often seem unpredictable. One week they appear healthy. The next week they suddenly stop growing well. But in many cases, the problem was building quietly underneath long before visible symptoms appeared. Healthy container gardening usually depends less on watering frequency and more on understanding moisture balance inside the pot itself. Not just the surface, not just the schedule, but the deeper root environment hidden below. One of the easiest ways to accidentally overwater a garden is to keep watering the same way through every season. Many gardeners develop routines during hot weather: daily watering, frequent checks, constant moisture. And during the peak of summer, that may sometimes make sense. But gardens do not use water the same way all year long. As temperatures cool, evaporation slows down, the soil stays moist longer, plants often grow more slowly, and roots may absorb water at a very different pace than they did just a few weeks earlier. But habits tend to continue even after conditions change. The schedule stays the same, the amount stays the same, the watering rhythm stays the same. This is especially common during seasonal transitions: early fall, rainy periods, cool, cloudy weeks. From the surface, the garden may still look active and green, but underground, moisture may already be lingering much longer than expected. And because these changes happen gradually, many gardeners do not notice the shift immediately. Containers become even more sensitive during these periods. A pot that dried quickly in midsummer may suddenly stay damp for days during cooler weather. And if watering frequency does not adjust with the season, roots can quietly remain under stress for long stretches. This is one reason experienced gardeners often pay more attention to conditions than routines. They observe temperature, sunlight, wind, humidity, and how quickly the soil actually changes after watering. Healthy gardening usually becomes easier once we stop treating watering like a fixed schedule and start treating it like an ongoing conversation with changing conditions. Because the garden is never exactly the same from one week to the next, and the soil responds differently every time the season changes. One interesting thing about healthy soil is that it rarely draws attention to itself. It usually doesn't look dramatic. It doesn't stay constantly wet, and it doesn't demand constant correction. Instead, healthy soil tends to create a quiet sense of balance in the garden. Plants respond steadily, growth feels natural, and the soil itself changes gradually in predictable ways after watering. From my experience, one of the clearest signs of healthy soil is how it feels after moisture begins settling in. Not muddy, not hard, not heavy. Just slightly moist, loose, and breathable. When you touch it, the soil often breaks apart naturally instead of sticking together like a dense mass. And after watering, excess moisture slowly moves downward instead of remaining trapped around the roots for days. Healthy soil also tends to support consistent root behavior. Plants recover from warm afternoons more easily. New growth appears steadily. Leaves maintain a more natural rhythm over time. Not perfect every single day, but resilient. Another subtle sign is airflow. In healthy soil, roots, microorganisms, moisture, and oxygen all continue interacting together underground. The environment feels active without feeling saturated. One thing many experienced gardeners eventually notice is that healthy soil often requires less intervention over time. Not because problems never happen, but because balanced soil recovers more naturally from small stresses. Heavy rain becomes less damaging. Warm weather becomes easier to manage. Watering decisions become simpler, and the garden starts feeling more stable overall. I think this is why long-term gardening becomes less about chasing perfect conditions and more about building soil that can adapt calmly to changing conditions over time. Because healthy soil is not just wet dirt. It is a living environment that supports balance, recovery, and steady growth beneath everything we see above ground. One of the biggest shifts many gardeners make over time is learning to stop guessing about soil moisture. At first, most people rely on appearance. The surface looks dry, the weather feels warm, the leaves seem slightly tired, so watering becomes an automatic response. But soil moisture is often very different below the surface than it appears from above. In many gardens, the top layer dries much faster than the deeper root zone. Sunlight, airflow, and heat affect the surface first. Meanwhile, several inches below, the soil may still be holding a large amount of moisture around the roots. This is especially true in containers, raised beds, heavy clay soil, and shaded areas. One of the simplest habits experienced gardeners develop is checking below the surface before watering. Not just looking, actually checking. Sometimes that means using your fingers, sometimes lifting a container to feel its weight, sometimes observing how quickly the soil changed since the last watering. And over time, these small observations become far more reliable than fixed schedules. Another useful habit is paying attention to how the garden responds after watering. Does the soil stay heavy for days? Does the plant recover naturally by evening without extra water? Does the container still feel damp underneath even when the surface looks dry? Those patterns tell us much more than appearance alone. Because healthy watering is not really about adding water regularly. It is about understanding how long moisture actually stays inside the root environment. I think one reason experienced gardeners become calmer over time is because they stop reacting to every small visual change immediately. Instead, they observe patterns. They wait, they check, they compare. And very often, that slower approach prevents far more problems than constant correction ever does. One of the most reassuring things about watering problems is that they often improve through small adjustments rather than dramatic rescue attempts. Many gardeners panic once they realize a plant may be overwatered, so they immediately stop watering completely, repot aggressively, add large amounts of amendments, or change multiple things at the same time. But stressed roots usually recover better in stable conditions than in sudden extremes. From my experience, one of the most effective changes is simply allowing the soil more time to breathe between waterings, not forcing the soil to become bone dry, just allowing excess moisture to leave naturally before adding more water again. That small pause alone can sometimes make a surprising difference over time. Another helpful adjustment is improving airflow around the root environment. For containers, this may mean checking drainage holes or reducing saucer water buildup. For garden beds, it may mean loosening compacted surface soil gently or reducing repeated shallow watering. Sometimes the solution is not more products, it is fewer interruptions. Observation also matters more than perfection. Healthy gardens still experience stress sometimes. Leaves still droop occasionally during heat. Rain still changes soil conditions. The goal is not to control every variable perfectly. It is to create conditions where the soil and roots can recover naturally most of the time. And that usually happens through consistency, patience, and balance, not constant correction. I think this is why experienced gardeners often make quieter decisions. They water less reactively, they observe longer before adjusting, and they trust gradual recovery more than dramatic fixes. Because healthy gardening is rarely about forcing rapid change. More often, it is about removing the conditions that quietly prevent healthy growth from happening on its own. One of the hardest parts about overwatering is that recovery usually moves much slower than damage. Many gardeners expect plants to improve quickly once watering changes, but roots that have been stressed for weeks often need time before healthy growth fully returns. And during that period, the garden can feel frustratingly unchanged. This is partly because roots recover underground first. Before leaves improve noticeably, before vigorous growth returns, before the plant looks healthy again, the root environment itself usually needs to stabilize. Airflow has to improve. Soil conditions have to rebalance. And stressed roots need time to begin functioning normally again. During this stage, many gardeners become impatient. The plant still looks weak. Growth still feels slow. Some leaves may continue aging or dropping. And because visible improvement is gradual, people often start changing multiple things again. More fertilizer, more watering adjustments, more products. But constant correction can sometimes interrupt the slow recovery process that roots are already trying to rebuild. From my experience, one of the most helpful things during recovery is consistency, Not perfect conditions, just calmer conditions. Balanced moisture, good airflow, stable routines, and enough time for the soil ecosystem to regain stability naturally. In many cases, healthy new growth appears slowly rather than dramatically. The leaves become slightly stronger. The plant responds better to heat. Growth begins extending again little by little. And those small changes are often more meaningful than dramatic overnight improvement. I think experienced gardeners eventually become more comfortable with slow recovery because gardening itself is naturally gradual. Roots rebuild gradually. Soil changes gradually. Healthy growth returns gradually. And sometimes, patience is not just emotionally helpful. It is actually part of the recovery process itself. I think one of the biggest changes that happens in gardening over time is not technical. It is emotional. Many people begin gardening with a strong desire to help every problem immediately. A drooping leaf appears, the watering can comes out. Growth slows, something gets adjusted. And honestly, that instinct usually comes from care. People want their plants to thrive. They want to protect the garden from stress. But over time, many experienced gardeners slowly realize that constant reaction can sometimes create more stress than patience does. Healthy gardens are rarely perfectly controlled. The soil changes, the weather changes, plants respond differently from week to week. And part of long-term gardening is learning which changes truly need intervention and which ones simply need observation and time. This mindset shift often changes watering habits first. Instead of reacting to every dry-looking surface, people begin checking deeper. Instead of watering from routine, they start responding to conditions. Instead of trying to fix plants quickly, they focus on improving the environment around the roots steadily over time. And surprisingly, gardening often becomes calmer after that. Not because problems disappear completely, but because observation begins replacing urgency. From my experience, healthier gardens usually come from quieter decisions. A little more patience, a little more airflow, a little less interruption. Not dramatic solutions, just better balance repeated consistently over time. And often, plants respond more naturally once they are no longer being pushed constantly in different directions. I think this is one reason gardening teaches patience so well. Because healthy growth almost never happens instantly. Roots build slowly. Soil improves slowly. Recovery happens slowly. And sometimes, the most meaningful progress in the garden is so gradual that you only notice it when you stop rushing long enough to truly observe it. One of the most important lessons in gardening is that healthy growth rarely comes from constantly doing more. Very often, healthier plants come from understanding balance more deeply. Not just adding water, not just reacting quickly, but learning how soil, roots, airflow, moisture, temperature, and time all work together quietly beneath the surface. Overwatering is difficult because it usually develops slowly. The leaves may stay green, the plant may still look alive, and the real stress often remains hidden underground long before visible damage appears. But once we begin observing the garden differently, many things become easier to understand. Healthy soil usually feels breathable. Healthy roots usually respond steadily. And healthy gardens often improve through patience more than constant correction. I think this is why experienced gardeners eventually spend less time chasing perfect routines and more time listening carefully to changing conditions. Because no season stays the same. No garden behaves exactly the same every week. And healthy gardening is often less about controlling nature perfectly and more about working gently with natural rhythms over time. So if your plants seem slower than usual lately, or if the soil stays damp longer than expected, don't panic immediately. Sometimes the most helpful response is simply slowing down long enough to observe what the garden is quietly telling you. And in many cases, small, balanced adjustments made consistently over time help far more than dramatic rescue attempts ever do. Because roots recover slowly, soil recovers slowly, and healthy growth usually returns the same way, quietly, gradually, and naturally. Thank you for spending time in the garden with me today. And if this video helped you see watering a little differently, I hope it also helped make gardening feel calmer and more enjoyable too. Take care, and I'll see you again in the next garden. Thank you for spending this time in the garden with me. If you found this helpful, don't forget to like the video and subscribe for more quiet, practical gardening
and hit
insights.
that subscribe button and the bell
I'll
icon
see you again
right there.
in the next one.